Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Alice Baumgartner. Alice is an assistant professor of history at the University of Southern California. And today we will speak about her book, South to Freedom, Runaway Slave to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. Alice, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, in a time period where there is so much racial distress in the United States and all over the world, because the movement is just expanding globally, this is one more book that adds to our understanding of slavery and how and how we cohabitate in North America, blacks, whites, and now immigrants of all kinds. So thank you so much for writing this book. My first question is, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. How is it that you became interested in history and your professional journey onto now that you became an assistant professor?
Well, I was a history major in college, but that was only because I hated chemistry. And so my ambitions of becoming an environmental scientist were destroyed by the chemistry class. And after graduating from college, I thought that maybe I would go work in a nonprofit or in public health. And so I took a job working in rural Bolivia at a free medical clinic. And I thought that my training as an undergraduate in history was just something that would be a hobby on the side. But while I was working with the patients at this clinic in Bolivia, once they found out that I had majored in history, they told me a lot of their own family stories, particularly about the Gran Chaco War in Bolivia in the 1930s. And it really struck me that these patients who were incredibly sick and often had very few resources, that history really mattered to them in a way that for me as an undergraduate history major, history had just seemed interesting. And that was really the beginning of me thinking that history might actually be a career that I could pursue that would hopefully have some larger positive impact on the people around me. And so that really is how I became or started to think more seriously about becoming a historian.
So that became your major, and from there, how is it that you decided to take a job as an assistant professor, or what was the trajectory until you got there?
Well, it was a very long trajectory, but after finishing in Bolivia, I got a master's at the University of Oxford in Latin American studies, which was always very confusing to the border control agents. They could not understand why I was coming to England to study Latin America, but there's a really wonderful historian of Mexico at Oxford who I worked with. And I thought I was going to be a Latin American historian. And on my first research trip to Mexico in the summer of 2012, I, by accident, found a lot of documents about enslaved people escaping to Mexico. And after I finished my master's, I started a PhD at Yale about that topic. And so I worked on that topic, writing first the dissertation, then the book for 8 years. And over the course of that time, I finished my PhD. I applied for jobs. If anyone's listening to this who is in the academic world, this will not be surprising to you, but I applied for 45 jobs and I got one. And I happened to be very fortunate in that it happened to be the University of Southern California, which is a really wonderful place to land.
And just out of curiosity, while you were in Bolivia, did you learn Spanish?
I did. I took Spanish all through high school and college and had done immersion programs through my high school and college, but it really was in Bolivia where I really, because I was working in Spanish, right, and technical medical Spanish too, and often actually with patients who spoke indigenous languages as their first language, and Spanish was also their second language, which was we would make mistakes together, which was reassuring to me. So I am not a native speaker by any means. I still make mistakes, but it really was that year of working in Bolivia that helped me turn classroom Spanish into a more usable facility with the language.
Well, the first surprise that I have when I was started reading your book is that I didn't have any idea that there was, for a period of time, slavery in Mexico. So could you? I mean, I bet most Americans don't know, and North Americans, to quote the term that you use in your book, and I will talk about that term in a minute as well. But yeah, could you let us know of the history of slavery in Mexico? Because most people don't know that that's a thing, and we just think of slavery as something that happens in the United States. And yeah, I was completely surprised.
Absolutely. It is a big surprise to, I think, most people that Mexico actually did have a large reliance on slavery in the colonial period. So in New Spain, as colonial Mexico was known, there was originally a reliance on indigenous laborers, but the arrival of Spanish pathogens decimated that population, and it forced the Spanish to have to come up with a different labor source. And that, of course, was African slaves. And between 1580 and 1640, New Spain imported more African slaves than any other colony in the Americas except Brazil. So it was a really important center of slavery in the New World during that the early colonial period. But the indigenous population in New Spain started to recover, and there are debates about when exactly that happened and what effect it had on Black slavery. But as the indigenous population recovered somewhere between the, mid 1700s, that there was a shift away from Black slavery in Mexico and towards relying on indigenous laborers who were participating in a varying degree of sort of coercive labor practices across Mexico. And so by the time that Mexico revolted against Spain and won its independence in 1821, there really weren't that many enslaved people anymore. By some estimates, it was about 10,000, so a really small number. And that's part of the reason why, although it's really interesting why we don't think of Mexico as a country that really relied on slavery even during the colonial period. But that's one of the reasons why we don't often associate it with slavery.
Okay, and another question. So England colonized North America, and then I guess North America become an independent country, the United States. At what time in history the United States decides to start importing slaves as a means of production?
So in the United States, enslaved people are imported from Africa also during the colonial period. And the importation of those enslaved people is one of the reasons why, or that Americans cite in their revolution against England. One of the reasons why they're revolting is because they claim that Great Britain had facilitated and encouraged the importation of enslaved people from Africa to a place where slavery had not existed before. So they are bringing enslaved people in from the colonial period. In 1808, Congress passes a law that prohibits the slave trade. And so that trade is officially illegal, but one of my colleagues, John Harris, just wrote a wonderful book called The Last Slave Ships, which really details all of the ways in which that slave trade continued in the United States even after 1808.
Okay, so now then the premise of your book is that all these slaves are escaping south of the border to Mexico. But also you make clear that most of the slaves were escaping to the north instead of to the south. I don't think they were organizing themselves and they were decided, should I go north or should I go south? I think it was a matter of opportunity. But do you know why most of them decided to go north instead of south, or why there was not a bigger population migrating south?
It's a really good question. That the estimates about the numbers of enslaved people who are escaping anywhere are hard to pin down with any certainty. But the estimates of the number of enslaved people who escaped to the northern states and Canada range between 30,000 at the lowest and 150,000 or more. So there's a big range, and that speaks to how uncertain it is about what the exact numbers are. My estimate for the number of enslaved people who escaped to Mexico is about 5,000. So it's significantly smaller. The reason for that has a lot to do with what, as you've put it, the opportunity of escape. And for enslaved people who were in the eastern seaboard of the United States, in the border states, that is the states that bordered the Mason-Dixon line, the line between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, that for them, escaping to the north made much more sense. And for most of US history, that is where the majority of the enslaved population was. Beginning in the 1820s and really accelerated in the 1830s and 1840s, there was what historians call the second middle passage. That's referring to that the middle passage is the passage across the Atlantic from Africa. The second middle passage is enslaved people being forced from the eastern seaboard to the south central United States, to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. And so it's really only after the second middle passage that we see a large population of enslaved people being taken to the south central United States. And it's really there where it makes sense to escape to Mexico rather than to the northern states. So a lot of it has to do with demography and the number of enslaved people in certain regions and when they are forced to go to those regions.
Okay, we are a little bit familiarized with the kind of reception or lifestyle that a slave had when they go to a free state. I mean, I guess they were able to live a normal life, except that they didn't have the right to vote. And of course, they would suffer against discrimination. So that's the idea that I have of a runaway slave from the south to the north. But when they run away to Mexico, what's the status? I mean, according to the book, they were, as soon as they reached the Mexican border, they were free. But how are they received?
So most enslaved people who escaped to Mexico, at least that I was able to find in the archival record, did one of two things once they reached Mexico. The first option was to join Mexico's military colonies, which was a series of military outposts on Mexico's northern border. And by joining the military colonies, enslaved people were agreeing to help Mexico defend its territory from foreign invaders of all kinds. That often was people from the United States, and it often also was indigenous peoples from the Great Plains and other neighboring regions that were raiding into northern Mexico. By joining the military colonies, by performing this military service, enslaved people not just won their freedom, but they also received land and the right to citizenship, which is incredibly important, as historians have long documented, for enslaved people, that citizenship, political belonging was really important, and land was a way to achieve that political independence and economic independence. So those are good advantages that enslaved people could get from joining the military colonies. But obviously military service came at the cost of, they had to risk their own lives, and they were also having to participate in Mexico's sometimes really quite brutal campaign against Native peoples. Wow. The other option for enslaved people was to join Mexico's labor force. And sometimes they joined that labor force. They found work in urban environments like the city of Matamoros, which had a really growing Black population that was people were hailing from the British Caribbean, from Haiti, from the United States. But many of them joined or found work in more rural locations, on haciendas and ranches. And for those enslaved people who found work, it was also sort of a mixed bag of what they were finding, that they were able to change masters, they had legal rights, not masters, I'm sorry, they were able to change employers, they had certain legal rights that were denied to enslaved people in the United States, but it is absolutely true that they often encountered coercive labor practices that were not the type of freedom, unadulterated freedom that, one might hope for. Right. At the same time, as you're pointing out, the options for enslaved people who escaped to the northern states in Canada weren't really that much better, or even to Haiti, that coercive labor practices arose in almost all post-emancipation societies. So indentured servitude, debt, peonage, tenancy, sharecropping, those are common features of post-emancipation society. So I don't mean to minimize the limitations on freedom in Mexico, but rather to recognize the fact that that's a pretty common situation to develop in the wake of slavery, to have different sorts of coercive labor practices.
Wow, they didn't have it easy either way, whether they went, even today, they still don't have it easy. No. But okay, so let me ask you, how this runaway slave to Mexico precipitated the road to the Civil War?
So the enslaved people who escaped to Mexico really helped to drive the Mexican government towards more radical anti-slavery policies. And how exactly that happened, I won't go into too much detail here, but the gist of it is that the Mexican government saw enslaved people escaping and joining the military and helping Mexico in all of these ways. And they sought to encourage that by abolishing slavery and by promising freedom to enslaved people. Mexico abolished slavery in 1837, again, for a variety of reasons, but the escape of enslaved people is really important to that larger story. And the abolition of slavery in Mexico becomes hugely important for the United States when the United States, under the administration of James K. Polk, provokes a war with Mexico that ends in 1848, with Mexico being forced to cede to the United States half of its territory, what is now the American Southwest. And this acquisition of territory was so controversial because it was the first time in US history that the United States had conquered territory where slavery had been explicitly abolished. And that was important because throughout US history, the United States had expanded, it had acquired territory. But as it expanded from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific, up until the US-Mexican War, they hadn't acquired territory where slavery had been explicitly abolished. And as a result of that, it made it easy for Congress to divide the spoils, divide that land between the non-slaveholding states and the slaveholding states. That's why we see that line, the Mason-Dixon line, the Ohio River, the line 3630 further to the west that separates the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. But when the United States acquires this land from Mexico, conquers really that land from Mexico, it's no longer possible to just divide the territory between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, because Northern congressmen and a fair number of Southern congressmen say that the US government and Congress in particular does not have the power to reestablish slavery where it has been previously abolished. And that's very terrifying to pro-slavery politicians in the United States, because if the entire American Southwest is closed to slavery, then it basically means that none of the remaining Western territories are open to slavery, and that as a result, this pro-slavery Southern interests are going to be outnumbered in Congress, particularly in the Senate.
Wow.
It's a lot. It's like drinking water out of a fire hose.
Yeah, you're giving me a lot to digest. Just to put it into context, slavery was abolished when in the United States, and we're then speaking about which time period. I guess you mentioned slavery abolished in Mexico in 1837, and it was abolished in the United States.
So it was, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln in 1863, but the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery, wasn't passed until 1865. So 1865 is probably the date we should use for the abolition of slavery in the United States legally.
And was there a law to prohibit the commerce of a slave in that time frame as well?
In the United States and in Mexico, actually, there was a law to prevent the importation of enslaved people from abroad. But at that time, the United States already had an enslaved population of over 1 million. So in 1808, there was already 1 million enslaved people in the United States, and that enslaved population was naturally reproducing. So they didn't actually need those foreign imports in order to maintain the enslaved population in the United States. And the enslaved population expands dramatically such that by 1860, there are over 3 million enslaved people in the United States. So there's just, even though there is that ban on the importation of slaves in the United States, because of the naturally reproducing enslaved population, it doesn't have, it doesn't make a huge dent in slavery in the US.
Wow. So that means that there were going to be, assuming there was not a civil war, there will be generation after generation of enslaved people. That's so gruesome.
Yeah, it really is.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, your book put everything. I mean, it opens our eyes a little bit wider to the injustice of slavery and the events of history that put an end to it. And I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you?
The title of the book is South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. And you can follow me on Twitter at it's A_L_Baumgartner. Good luck spelling my last name, but
it will be in the show notes.
You can Google me, and it'll come up. And I'm my email is also all over the internet. My USC email. So I really welcome any questions that anyone might have.
Well, this is an amazing history book. Alice, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.